Welcome. We're so glad to have you with us. My name is Makiba McCrary, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Patty and Jonathan Kraft Chief of Learning and Community Engagement here at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Thank you again for joining us for this special series of conversations between Rosa Rodriguez-Williams, the first ever Senior Director of Belonging and Inclusion, and staff members from across the institution. This is titled MFA Voices, and this is offering you, our viewers, a chance to hear about work from various departments. And Rosa will introduce her guest today shortly. But first, we would like to acknowledge that the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, founded in 1870, stands on the historic homelands of the Massachusetts people, a site which has long served as a meeting place and exchange among different nations. As a museum, we acknowledge the long history of the land we occupy today and seek ways to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and programming. Over to you, Rosa.
Thank you, Makiba, and thank you for being with us and joining our conversation. My name is Rosa Rodriguez-Williams. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and ella. It is my pleasure to welcome you to MFA Voices, a series that pulls back the veil and goes behind the objects and art to spotlight folks across the museum and their work. Welcome to day 5. We made it, and it has been an incredible week. And I'm so excited to be with all of you again today. Yesterday, we had a great time talking to Edward Green, and today we have another fantastic conversation lined up for all of you. But before we get into it, let's take a few seconds or minutes to go through some housekeeping. Portions of the program will be recorded and available as a recording later this spring. A quick note, when the recording is taking place, you're welcome to turn off your video and mute your audio in order to not be included. The majority of the recording will only show the speakers. A transcript and closed captions for this program are available through Rev for Zoom live captions. If you would like to enable closed captions, go to the bottom of the Zoom window, click the up arrow button next to closed caption, and then click on show subtitle to start displaying Rev live captions. Speakers and I will try to say our name when a new speaker begins to help lend clarity to the transcript. During the session, questions and comments can be shared via Zoom's chat or raise your hand function. And now I am super excited to introduce you to my guests. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Adam Tessier. Adam is the Barbara and Theodore Alfond Director of Interpretation. In that role, he works closely with teams across the museum to develop ways for visitors to engage and connect with the work of art in our care and with each other. We'll talk more about that today. Adam brings a variety of experiences to his role. He trained for nearly 20 years as a classical musician, studied art history at Vassar College, and holds a master's of fine arts degree in poetry from Bennington. He also worked for a while as an artisan ice cream maker. Adam was born and raised on the South Shore of Boston and currently lives on the North Shore. And this year marks his 15-year anniversary at the MFA. Happy anniversary, Adam. That's amazing. 15 years and welcome.
Wild.
Pretty wild. I'm super excited. We have to talk offline about the totality of those 15 years. But let's get started with some questions. So tell us about your work at the museum. You know, Adam, when I first started here, the first day I met you, it was on a Zoom call. And you pulled up this little notepad or index card, and it said, interpretation equals belonging. So share with us what you meant with that, one, and two, what you do here.
I just went to reach for that note card, but I realized I've been to the museum since that meeting, and it's on my desk at the museum right now, actually. The note card kind of travels with me, and I think that's a great way to enter a description of what we do in interpretation and what I do. You know, historically, interpretation has described the different ways that we try to meet our visitors in our galleries, right? The text that we write on the walls to describe the works of art or to characterize the exhibition or gallery that you're walking in. The content that's on the audio guide or the touchscreen interactives you'll find in some galleries, videos that you'll find. We work with staff across the building to create all of those. And historically, interpretation has usually sat within a museum's education department or sometimes in their exhibitions department. And historically, and still today at many institutions, interpretation is really seen as an outgrowth of a museum's educational mission or their curatorial practice, right? Here at the MFA, we have a very different structure that is really important to me, and I think important to the field, where interpretation sits in inclusion with you, Rosa. And I think that raises all sorts of interesting questions about what are the priorities of our work? Why are we here to do this work? I like to think about interpretation less in terms of what visitors will learn when they come into our galleries and more in terms of what they bring into the galleries with them, right? I think museums oftentimes think about audiences in ways that are think about audiences as needing to be informed or as needing to come to learn about what we have to offer as consumers of the products we make, which are exhibitions and galleries and programs. I really like to think about our visitors as this distinct body of diverse expertise, right? And what they do when they come into our galleries is they bring that expertise to bear on what we show, and that changes things. I think that affects the experience of the exhibit of the art. I think that affects the experience that we have socially within the museum, and I think that interpretation needs to take into account all of the structures that are in place that allow or prevent you from being yourself at the museum. Because if you really do feel a sense of belonging, I think you engage more deeply with the art, right? You connect with the art. It means differently. It resonates differently. So that's what interpretation thinks about increasingly, I think.
Yeah. How would you say that, you know, the field has changed? You mentioned that that it's the way we sort of do it at the MFA is different than other institutions. How has that changed in the last few years?
Well, it's really interesting to think about, and it's really the most amazing gift to work at the MFA in interpretation, I have to say. And I should note that when I came into this work, I wasn't super familiar with museum interpretation. It's not a very old field in art museums. I mean, interpretation exists and has long existed at aquariums, at national parks, historic houses. Art museums were probably the last major cultural institutions to start adopting the role of interpretation usually in their education areas. But the Museum of Fine Arts was one of the first. Beginning in 1990, we had people working in the education department with curators in partnership on beginning, especially with the text that would appear in the galleries and the audio guide that would accompany exhibitions. And I think over time, that role has expanded. But we have 30 years of amazing partnerships that have been built between curators and interpretive planners to build upon. And so we're in a very different position, I think, than a lot of institutions who have only been working with interpretation for 5 years, 10 years, even 15 years, who are still trying to understand what partnership between educators and curators can look like in a museum where that didn't exist before. So we have a long-standing kind of base to build upon. We also view, I think, interpretation, as much as we view it as a visitor-centered, practice, I do view my role in a great deal as being an advocate for curatorial vision as well. Part of what we do is think really critically with curators about the content and about the story that they want to share with visitors, and think with them and alongside them about how to make that resonant for our visitors. Where are the hooks for them to grab onto? Where are the moments of connection and meaning that we can highlight? And I think that way of thinking is very different at the MFA than it is at a lot of institutions. There are still many art museums that don't have interpretation at them.
Yeah.
So we're very lucky.
Adam, where does Table of Voices sit in all of this? We want to tell us a little bit about what Table of Voices is and where sort of in your process, how is it helpful?
Table of Voices is fascinating. I do just want to, before I get to Table of Voices, I do just want to give, it occurs to me, since this is an internal conversation, I should also name names. I mean, since 1990, there have been very few people that have worked in interpretation at the MFA. We've all been in the position for a long time, with Barbara Martin leading the charge in the 1990s, Ben Weiss following her, Jillian Shallcross, who was before that, and Catherine Johnson-Rare, who is my partner in interpretation right now as well. So there's just this amazing history, along with all of the great curatorial staff. Now, Table of Voices is an amazingly interesting initiative that we launched 2 years ago, in late 2019, so I guess a year and a half ago. Thanks to funding provided by the Lindy Family Foundation and Joyce Lindy. Now, Table of Voices is, I think at its core, it is, how do I explain this? Table of Voices is a platform that we're using to engage in new ways expertise from beyond the museum and from beyond our field in the exhibitions and the stories, the exhibitions and galleries that we create and the stories that we tell. What does that mean and what does that look like? So I think if you think about your audience as experts and you think about all of the knowledge that they bring to bear in what you create in your exhibitions and galleries, and then you think about what you're actually creating and the stories that you're trying to tell, I think it's really important for us to remember to step back and think about authority and think about expertise really critically. And for us to think about whose stories these are to tell, right? And a great example of this thinking, I think, is the Gender Bending Fashion exhibition that happened in 2019. Now, this was before Table of Voices existed in a formal way. But that was an exhibition that really began with an important conversation between the curator, Michelle Finnemore, myself as interpretive planner, and Chelsea Garanay, the designer for the exhibition. And that conversation was around what we don't know. And I think this is a really important thing that we don't often think about. You know, what don't we know? What are we not experts in?
Mm-hmm.
We think an awful lot about what we do know, what we can tell our visitors, what we can share. With gender bending fashion, we had to pause and say, okay, we know the fashion, we know the objects really well. We know the history really well. What do we know about the history of gender diversity? What do we know about the history of gender identity, of sexual orientation and sexuality? What do we know about gay rights? About, you know, are we expert in any of this? No. So can we make an exhibition that really resonates with our audiences without bringing that very special expertise to bear on the creation of the project? And so we went about creating a really, in retrospect, kind of nutty process of grabbing as many people from around town as we could to weigh in on what we were doing and responding when we got comments and reaching out on social media and bringing new partners in for conversations. We ended up partnering with partners from the Fenway Institute, from their trans health program. We ended up partnering with individuals from universities, artists, folks from all over town, activists, and not just, and when I say partner with them, I mean, we created interpretation with them, but we also created content with them. We created experience with them. We brought them into the process to understand how the exhibition was being built. And we listened very closely to what mattered to them and brought it to bear in all of the work that we did. It's work like that that has actually been going on for a long time, often led by curators. I think back to the work that Laura Weinstein has done on her collection, the Islamic collection at the MFA. She did several years ago called Sacred Pages, where she worked with individuals to create, from the local Islamic community centers, to create that exhibition, to choose the objects, to develop the interpretation. Table of Voices was developed structure to this, to these efforts, and to really examine what are the possibilities that are unlocked by the adjacency of all of our work, interpretation and curatorial, but now interpretation with folks in inclusion, including audience development, team programs, evaluation. What happens when you bring people together?
Yeah. And so tell me, Adam, how did you end up here? What was your trajectory to this role? You've shared a little bit as we prepared for this talk with me, so I want you to share with folks here how interesting your journey has been to get to the museum.
That's a fantastic question. Thanks.
Mhm.
I actually answer this question a lot. I love to, to work with graduate students, museum studies, interns, folks that are interested in interpretation. When I came into this field, I was given an incredible chance by Barbara Martin, who hired me. I think taking a great risk because I didn't have a great deal of experience in this area. And so I'm very aware of the importance of talking to folks about interpretation, socializing and understanding of the work and how the work is changing. So I love to talk about this, but I get that question from everybody all the time. How did you get to where you are now? And I always have to say, I wouldn't really follow what I did. I'm the quintessential person that can never make up my mind. My partner hates going to restaurants with me. I spend 20 minutes with the menu and then still don't know what. It was the same thing when I was in college. I studied art history, but I also studied music very seriously. I studied English, I studied classics. Even within art history, which was my major, I couldn't pick a focus. We had to pick an area, and I wanted to do contemporary, and I wanted to do ancient, and I wanted to do 17th century Spanish art. Like I just couldn't settle. And so when it came time for thinking about graduate school and all of my colleagues were going to PhD programs for art history, I thought, I can't do this. I don't know what I want to do. I don't know what I want to study. I can't pick. It's all so good. So I thought I would take a couple of years off and see if I couldn't find what I wanted to study. That's when I began working at the MFA. And if you're a person that can't choose, an encyclopedic museum isn't especially useful in your efforts. It's just so incredible. I continue to not be able to choose. So I went and I got an MFA in poetry, which was another great love of mine. So I have a degree in art history, and I have a terminal degree in poetry, and neither of those things, I think, disqualify you from doing interpretation. In fact, I think they're wonderful qualifications, but I wouldn't follow those. I tell people I wouldn't follow that as a path to get into museum interpretation. But I think what got me here was a curiosity, a fundamental curiosity about storytelling and about how people connect to works of art. I've always been a person that, I grew up in a very working class family for whom museums were not the typical outing. It wasn't where we would go. And so it wasn't until later in life that I started going to museums. I had a wonderful eccentric aunt that started bringing me, and I just fell in love. And that love has never gone away. And I knew I wanted to work with art. I knew I wanted to work in a museum. And lo and behold, there's a job where you get to tell stories and learn new things every day. I mean, it's wonderful. Today, I got up and I worked on Table of Voices for a while, thinking about different roundtables that we're going to be pulling together for exhibitions coming up. I worked on ancient Greece and Rome. I've worked on Dutch art. I've had a meeting about Chinese paintings, and it's 12. So for a person that can't decide, it's heaven.
Yeah, I mean, I have 1,000 more questions about process and thinking, but I'm going to invite Makiba to come on so that other folks can ask questions as well.
I'm back. Great. Okay, so we already have some questions popping in here. One is about Philip Guston, and a question about how involved you are, and maybe perhaps Adam, just to be able to talk a little bit about the group that's working together and how you're approaching things.
Guston is an amazing question. Thank you for asking that. I guess I'll start with where we're at for Guston, right? And I think at Guston, we're at a point of asking a lot of questions of ourselves about what are our goals for visitor connection and engagement in that exhibition. What exhibition are we trying to make with this work? What are we trying to say about Guston? We're talking very carefully about about that story. The team that has been put together is really amazing. Kate Nessen, who is adjunct curator in contemporary art, is our Guston expert on the project. Ethan Lasser, who's chair of Art of the Americas, is the internal lead on the project. Me as director of interpretation, and then Terrence Washington, who is in New Haven, is an art historian and artist. He worked at the National Gallery and works in organizations in New Haven. Is also on the project. He's been very involved in the very public art world response to the delay of the exhibition, and has a wonderful mind and is pushing us to think in really incredible ways about Guston and the story, and importantly, how visitors will bring their own experiences to this work and what that means, what the stakes are for us. It's going to be a challenging project, but I believe that we will develop a process of consultation and participation that will make it strong.
Agreed. Can you share a little bit about the ways we've used technology? I know gender bending was my first experience, but even since then, Ancient Nubia Now and certainly Writing the Future has had aspects of multimedia for its interpretive approach.
Think about the ways people engage in galleries and learn in galleries. People learn and engage in many, many, many ways. And so interpretation should never be one note, right? You should never just think in one mode. You should think about different ways that people can enter into the story and into the material. So that often takes the form of different technological delivery methods, right? We're very lucky that we have incredible partners across the institution in creative and interactive media, headed up by Janet O'Donoghue, that we partner with to develop things like the scripts for the videos that you find in galleries. We work with her team on interactivity, and we work with our colleague in information technology, George Sharoon, on how this works in the galleries and how visitors engage with technology in the galleries. I always like to think about it from a very specific approach, however. If there is something that there's a part of the story you want to tell, there's a point you want to make, there's something you want to do in the exhibition that calls for an interpretive solution, right? You need to find the exact right solution for it, right? If it can be done in text, don't do it in video. If it can be done in video, if it's best done in video, don't write a text panel about it. You need to think about the entire picture of how people are going to be engaging and match the format to the content, I believe. So an example of that I think is really interesting is, if you remember, in Gender Bending Fashion, when you get almost to the end of the exhibition, almost to the last gallery, there's this big screen display highlighting 10 different Bostonians and their approaches to style and their thoughts on gender, that really centered those perspectives in the exhibition in a big, very full, dynamic way. Then you went into the learning space, and there was a touch screen where you got to engage more deeply with each of them. So there were two modes of the same sort of story, both delivered in technology and both fascinating. I also love non-technology. I know I'm going on and on, but I also love like Post-it notes and stuff like that. You don't think about them as technology, but it is another way of doing interpretation and doing evaluation and creating opportunities for visitors to engage and have their voice in a gallery. And people love it. Like we do a Post-it note area in an exhibition, and there's 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 responses that we get. And we actually very carefully catalog all of them, code all of them, and get from them the data that they give us about how visitors are experiencing the works of art, how they're where they're finding challenge, where they're finding joy, how it's speaking to them, where they're finding meaning. So it's really useful.
There's a question from David. He'd love for you to talk a little bit more about how museum educators might work with visitors who are bringing unique experiences into the museum, and what sort of role interpretation might play in that. I think it makes me think of a little bit about our conversations around family.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's an incredible question. I think at Minneapolis, they've been developing over years a center for understanding empathy in the context of the art museum that really interests me as a lens through which all of our work should pass. I know that sounds very simple, but understanding each other and understanding tools towards being empathetic can go a long way for all of us that are outward facing in big institutions like this. A thing that what Makiba was referencing is a discussion we're having around families and interpretation. Interpretation has always focused, at least what I've been responsible for, is really focused on adult visitors. And families have been served by family programs, and occasionally we'll do family labels in the galleries that are written by family program staff, but it's never really been part of the remit of interpretation under me. We've recently entered into a conversation with family educators about what would it mean, like how are we showing up for families in our galleries? How are we providing them with resources that are interpretive and otherwise to experience exhibitions? And I think as we begin to confront in our projects, the really important issues of our moment. I'm thinking right now of Fabric of a Nation, the quilts exhibition that'll be opening this fall, I believe, at the museum, that looks at race really critically, that looks at the legacy of the Civil War, that looks at xenophobia and homophobia and all of these issues, not in a downer way, in a really powerful way, but how do we prepare families to engage with that material? What are we doing in that exhibition to engage families? What are we doing in our Greek galleries to engage families where there exist a lot of toeholds for them to get in? I mean, these are gods and monsters and goddesses and everything that is in the curriculum and is in cartoons and is in picture books. What are we doing? How are we showing up? So it's something that interpretation is taking on right now for those two projects in partnership with educators to really examine that, to pull together roundtables, to talk with people outside of the building about how can we show up and help you have these conversations. So more
Fantastic.
on that front.
Yeah. I still want my hologram. I want an interpretive hologram in the middle of Harriet Powers. Let's see, Amanda Corvu, how do you approach the balance between making exhibition information accessible and making sure you don't simplify the context too much? And then I think actually an important, you can weave this in, Richard's asking how early in the process does the interpretive questions begin? Do they begin? Where should they begin?
I'll start with Richard's question, and that is the most amazing question in our field right now. At the MFA, we come right at the beginning. I sit on the team that counsels Matthew and leadership team on the exhibitions and galleries that have been proposed by curators to move forward, along with leadership team, the head of design, lots of individuals in the institution. So we're in the conversation right from the very beginning, and that's essential. So from the moment an exhibition or a gallery is approved, we should be in conversation with the curators and the designers, and we should be building the experience together. From that perspective, you're thinking about your visitor and you're thinking about centering their expertise and their experience from the very beginning, as you're talking about the expertise and experience that the team and the institution is bringing to bear as well. And you stand a better chance, I think, of equity in that and in that scenario. For the question of how do you make a balance between accessibility and simplification, this is a really interesting challenge. I always say I love complicated ideas. I don't like complicated expression, right? And I used to have this diagram that I would show people that, like, the more complicated the idea, the more simple the language you should use to explain it. There's nothing wrong with simplicity. I think it's a tonal question as well. And my predecessor, Ben, always had this amazing way of characterizing what a label next to a work of art should do, that I still hold on to as just the most amazing description. He always said that the label should be like the host at a cocktail party. They introduce you to somebody you've never met before, give you something to talk about, and then fade away. And I think about that as well. I feel thinking, trying to hit with tone and language in the label is what perpetuate the conversation. People say has to be really believe that. I think people, it stops being interesting. So thinking text that has verve and that has personality and that has voice, that has a point of view, I think is also important to that question.
Thanks, Adam. I think we're about at the end. Rosa, do you have one last question for Adam, or do you want me to shoot my best shot?
Yeah, shoot your last shot. And yeah, we're at time, so go ahead, Vakiba.
Thing that you're most excited about in working with Rosa as she begins her career here at the museum?
Perfect. That was my question too.
Well, I think to go back to the kind of very beginning in my index card that travels around with me, that interpretation is belonging. This is something new. I mean, I think we're looking at, from the way that Makiba has structured our department and the way that interpretation is now poised to do this kind of work, to combine like visitor-centered thinking with community organizing principles, I think is something that you're uniquely positioned to lead me on, Rosa. I mean, my experience and expertise is in art and in writing. This is all new work for me as well. And the thought that I look around and see you, and I see Nadia, and I see Makiba, and I see that my colleagues are, centering this work in their practice for their entire careers. I'm just excited for what I'm gonna learn and absorb, and how that's gonna improve what we do, and what curators do, and what designers do, and how it's gonna change us.
Well, I'm super excited to work with you, Adam. Thank you for being with us today and for sharing your story and your expertise and what you do. Thank you to all of you for showing up for MFA Voices this week. We've had a great time. Makiba, thank you for being a great partner in all of this. And yeah, we'll see you all in the galleries.